Yeah, I guess art for me has always been kind of a big part of my life. Especially growing up, I had an uncle who was super into drawing. And my family originally, they weren't necessarily any artists in my family. I think the only family members I had were, we had a cousin who was a painter, my uncle who drew, and then we had an uncle who was a great photographer. And so I've had a little bit of art kind of surrounding my family, but it's never really been viewed as sort of a profession. And it wasn't until about high school that I sold my first painting. And from there, that kind of gave me inspiration of like, okay, maybe there is kind of a career in all of this. I knew it would be a lot of hard work. I knew it wouldn't be easy. And that was kind of a risk I was willing to take. More so to kind of prove to my family and friends and such that it is like possible if you really, a little bit cheesy to say, but like if you really set your mind to it, like you can create those opportunities for yourself. And you know, I started off doing a lot of like graffiti art in high school. I really love sort of that pop art style and the contrast in colors there. And it wasn't until right towards the end of high school that I started working with Ryan, who was actually heading up this mural. And incredible painter, I started working more with him and kind of fine-tuning sort of the more fine art side of it. So we would do a lot of classical studies of like old school paintings. And then it started to get to a point where once I learned a lot of that, it was like, how can I mix that new school with sort of that old school? And little by little, it started to get bigger and bigger. And I started to say like, okay, like, how can I go kind of beyond the canvas? And I started to paint on like skateboards, you know, different things that I could find. And then it started to get bigger and bigger until I started doing these murals. And with those murals kind of came almost like a different sense of responsibility, I guess. You know, you're doing this large piece for the community, and sometimes you have to ask, like, do you set certain boundaries for yourself? Like, what message do you want to convey? And that's just one of the many challenges that kind of comes with it. I was actually at work when I had received this like totally random email. And I kind of read the headline a little bit and had said something involving the library. And I kind of was like, oh, it's, you know, really random. It was a submission to my website. And yeah, during my work break, I like read over the email real quick. And normally I'm the worst with emails, but we're on this planet, like I'll claim it right now, I'm awful with emails. And I like read over it, and it was Ryan mentioning this new kind of a library card project that they're doing, and that they're looking for an artist to design the new one.
This is a project we wanted to do for years. The thing that really jumped out at me was looking through some of Adrian's sketchbooks and seeing kind of this more surrealistic vibe that he was kind of doodling that he wasn't doing as much in his bigger, more realism based artwork and murals and stuff. So I reached out to him and said, hey, I really like this stuff. What can we do with that?
And I thought that was such a rad idea. I like immediately just replied on my phone. I was like, yes, totally down. Let's meet up. Let's plan a day. And from there, yeah, we just got into talking and kind of like looking over ideas that we could do for the project and kind of brainstorming from there. What is up? Welcome to the studio. I think what's really interesting, and it's similar with murals in a way, designing this library card, which I've been so excited about, you kind of take a step back and think a little bit differently than you would normally painting. Because a lot of the paintings that I do here, I'm like, this is kind of my own interest, this is for me. But when you're doing a mural or a library card or a design that's gonna be out to the public, you put on kind of a different like thinking cap. And you're thinking more so like, what do I wanna represent with this project? Like who's gonna be looking at it? What message do I want to give out? And with this project in particular, and especially the time that we're releasing this library card, I've been thinking a lot about kind of my childhood over in Mexico and elements that I can bring into that. So I'm doing kind of a blend of sort of how I feel when I'm reading books. And to me, I think reading is interesting and applying it to this because it's like, you're reading this book and you're almost like thinking less in your own thoughts, and I'm trying to imagine like what this person was writing about. And I want to kind of exemplify that in this project, right? Is like include elements of my childhood growing up in Mexico, but include elements of like what people might experience when they're reading a book, sort of that curiosity, that wonder, and sort of finding this overlapping of how I can represent both of those in a really inclusive kind of project. So for me, when I was thinking of this design, I had kind of 3 words in mind, and it was cultural, creative, and curious. And part of it had to do with sort of the library books that I've actually been recently reading. One thing that always piqued my interest and I've actually wanted to learn more about, and it's been fun with this project learning more about it. Back in my hometown, they do a lot of these small festivals, especially in areas like Colima, Michoacan, and this specifically is in near kind of Guadalajara area. But they have a lot of festivals where they do these big parades, and everybody has these handmade masks that they wear. And a lot of them have different symbolism. If anybody knows about El Danza de los Viejitos, I'm terrified of that. Ever since I was a kid, I was like mortified of those masks. But then now that I'm older, like they piqued a lot of curiosity, and I always think back to that moment of just me screaming my head off, but they would like dance with me. And that's kind of where I wanted to take this concept, is taking some of those elements of that curiosity I had as a kid, and even me now growing up wanting to learn a little bit more about that part of my culture, and implementing it into the library card design. You know, I wanted to include something that had sort of those cultural elements of those masks that you find in like Colima. Specifically, this mask is from an area in Michoacan, this style of like dog mask. And I also, like, one of my favorite pieces of imagery with a lot of the celebrations that happen over in Mexico is like, obviously like the Day of the Dead Skulls is a big one. And I thought sort of those colors and that bright, almost like cheery aspect with something that's kind of dark is kind of this cool, I guess, kind of balance, right? Where you have something that's like inherently creepy, but you're adding this like fun element of like the color. It's very flashy. I also put in a little bit of a personal tone because I'm always like curled up in bed reading a book. That's why I have the figure kind of laying down. It's funny because in school, like reading was kind of almost like a chore for me. But now that I'm a little older, and I think now that I've been reading more, like I appreciate books a lot more. So to me, now it's almost like this reward at the end of the day when I get to sit back and not really think about a whole lot and just focus on like what's going on in the book. And that's kind of why I wanted this mishmash. And you see this almost like wave-like motion going up to the imagery around the guy reading. It's almost like a little bit of an escape, right? To really capture sort of that like relaxing aspect of reading, I think is important. I think throughout this project, I realized that I, over time, kind of done like a 180. When I first started doing art, I was really uptight about every mark I would make. Painting a face would take me like days and days and days at a time because I'm like, oh, this has to be like perfect. It was all the details that no one would ever notice that I was like hyperfixated on. And with painting this one, I realized that like I like a little bit of a messiness to the drawings that I'm doing. And not that it's like inherently messy, but I like this bit of like looseness. Almost like this reminder that it's like this handmade thing. Especially when you're sketching, I wanted to create kind of like a sketch kind of look on this one. There's just something about the mark making. You can get away with so much, but it still looks cool. And I think that's something I'm gonna bring back into my work that I'm doing now, especially my painting work. I used to be the type to be like, oh, like books, I don't really have time for that. And it's maybe not like my thing, because I'm always like all over the place with my scheduling. I was sick for like 2 weeks and I was like, you know what I should do? I'll just buy this book that I heard about. And now that I'm sick, I'll try reading. I got headaches watching TV while I was sick. I couldn't play video games. I was like, all right, let's go back to the basics. And I bought this book, as Tender as the Flesh, and I was so into it. I don't know, like I genuinely felt like the creative side of my brain was working a little bit more because, you know, I'm like reading something and I'm like actively imagining it. It couldn't have come at a better time, like reading, because especially for a project like this one where it's a lot more creatively driven, I think that reading had a huge, huge impact on that. You get sometimes so focused on like looking at a reference photo, painting from a reference, but when you kind of let go of that and you're reading like say a book where you don't have a reference, the reference just that text, and you have to make that imagery, activates that little part of your brain where you're like, this is kind of cool. Like I want to keep creating from this little pocket in my brain that's like conjuring up, you know, random imagery. So I think, yeah, it's definitely had an impact on like the creative side of the way that I look at things.